Hello and welcome to Architecture, Design, and Photography. I have to apologize for the audio quality. This is the first podcast we've done that has not been in studio because of the current situation with social distancing. So the audio quality is a little less, but the quality of information here is superb. We spoke with Pascal Molenat, and I cannot express how much important information is in this conversation with Pascal. He is a director of marketing at OTJ Architects in Washington, D.C., where he is also a principal. He's been in the marketing of architecture for over 15 years now, I believe. I've been working with Pascal for probably a little over a decade. Pascal is incredibly good at what he does, incredibly well thought out, intentional, and intelligent. I cannot say enough good things about Pascal as a professional and as a friend. There is so much valuable information for both architectural photographers and architects in this interview. We're just going to go right into it. Listen to what's said by Pascal here. There's so much good information. Enjoy. Pascal, thank you so much for taking some time. How have you been handling this COVID-19 sheltering in place?
It's definitely been a unique experience. I think it's taught me two things. One, there's very little you can't do by working remotely. So more traditional architecture firms have historically been reluctant to allow their staff to work remotely. We are fortunate where we deployed a technology arsenal years ago, partly in response to a real estate strategy, since we were outgrowing our space so quickly, where we made it possible for everyone in the company to work remotely. So in a time like this, the transition was really seamless. But I know that's not the case for everyone. However, as much as we're able to work effectively remotely, there's some downsides, partly the fact that the day never ends. So when your computer is there just waiting for you and staring at you in the kitchen table from 7 a.m. until, I look at the timestamps on some of these emails. I'm like, I can't believe I was emailing at 1:30 in the morning. What was I doing? What was so important?
Right.
And of course, I never thought I'd miss my coworkers this much. For everyone who complains about their coworkers, reheating fish in the microwave, you're going to be so happy to see them again.
It's interesting. Like for me, being a pretty introverted person, that I'm kind of really enjoying this.
And I probably shouldn't broadcast this, but I've been on a number of conference calls that didn't require my immediate participation, where I was just there to listen.
Right.
And it's amazing how much you can get done in terms of folding laundry and cleaning out drawers in the process. Right. So I have also caught up on a number of household projects, but now I'm running out of them. So
everything gets in order. What happens? All right. So the first thing I wanted to run by you, what does the process feel like to you when determining if something looks good? What's going through your head when you're looking at a potential composition? How do you process good and bad in that aesthetic situation?
So I guess one of the first things I would say with regards to composition is that in terms of contemporary architectural photography, in my time in the business, I've seen a shift from what I would describe as more expository shots, with photographers who were more documentarians, if you will, to a combination of those same expository shots supported by very carefully tailored vignettes. That's really the influence of the publishing world seeping into the architectural world. We found that a story told exclusively from an expository wide-angle type of view falls very flat, but when you tell it from the perspective of the details of the craftsmanship of the project, it can suddenly shine. So it depends on the project. So in terms of composition, first I try to balance that. I think of the story that we're trying to tell. How well are we telling that story through a composition of vignettes and composition of more establishing shots? I think anybody who is done marketing for architectural services brings to the process a certain awareness of an existing portfolio, whatever gaps may be there. What is the story that we need to tell at a very high level to sell this project and help us win more work? And then last but not least, I think this is the part that really can't be taught, which is I think some people have more of a wiring towards aesthetics, towards visuals, towards compositions.
Sure.
That's the part that I really struggle to explain to younger staff. They either have it or they don't. I think you can refine it over time if you have it, but I don't think it can be taught. In my case, I studied film in college. I took photography classes. I think that's probably, and it was probably ingrained, and I just sort of followed a path that was already of interest to me. But I remember even sitting in photography classes when we would critique other students' work, and I would zero in on compositional elements saying, this shot feels like it would be stronger if you shifted the camera a bit to the left, or if this weren't so closely cropped at the top. Now, mind you, I'm a terrible photographer, so I can't take the photo myself. I'm a critic and I can edit it, but I can't start the composition. So that's kind of what's going through my mind when I'm looking at it. And I think that's why it's important to work with a photographer who has a variety of tools in his or her arsenal, right?
Sure.
So when you work with someone who shoots exclusively these wide expository shots, that's a certain school of architectural photography that I think is dated. So I think we're better served when we have someone who has more of an editorial eye.
Right. Now, it's interesting having an architectural background and then going into working for publications. You, I remember, actually brought me in for the first portfolio viewing, and it said, I'd brought you in because you have something that's a little bit more of a residential feel, which I think comes from meeting the needs of the publishing shelter publications that I had worked for in the past. But that we could take that and use it in communicating what architectural firms have done in the commercial realm.
And that's exactly right. And that first meeting that you and I had actually was the result of a pretty extensive benchmarking exercise that we had conducted at Ad Inc. because we were aware that our photography, we invested a lot of money in photography, absent technology and salaries for that firm at that time. And I should say that firm no longer exists. It was acquired by another entity. So I'm comfortable sharing this information. Architectural photography was, again, absent salaries and technology, the largest line item budget for the firm. So there was a real commitment to photography. There was a real appreciation of the value of photography, but also a recognition that we had worked with the same photographers for a very, very long time. And we wanted to ask ourselves, are we representing our projects in the most contemporary way, with the understanding that our clients were now more and more accustomed to telling us, to experiencing the story of a space the way they would in an architectural publication.
Right.
So we did benchmarking, and that's when we came back and we said, well, there is an opportunity to tell stories about the workplace that are shot with a residential quality. Of course, that was also at a time when residential design was intersecting with workplace design, so it made a lot of sense.
That's the other thing that keeps me awake at night, is staying ahead of the curve. Where are we becoming dated in our representation of our work, and where do we want to go with this?
Well, I think it keeps many of us thinking, right? Ever since I started in this industry, people have been asking themselves, what's next in terms of architectural photography? And that was 15 years ago. And, I remember, say, 7 years ago, there was this notion that still photography was going to go the way of the dinosaur and it was all going to be replaced by video. Well, that hasn't happened. And we saw some people playing around with some very gimmicky effects where it was a still photo with a little bit of an animation, say maybe the fireplace was flickering.
Right.
And some people thought that was it. That's how you had to represent projects. Again, that didn't really take off. I think for me, the evolution that I've seen is in terms of the retouching of the photos. There's certain tonal values that changed depending on the decade, right? Some images look a little yellower, some images look a little bluer.
Yeah,
and then I think as Photoshop, as people became more and more proficient with Photoshop, the more you could do. There was an era when, not so long ago, when images were retouched to death. And, suddenly you couldn't tell if it was a rendering or an image. And I think we're still a little bit there. There's still some people who go a little overboard in that direction. So I would guess that as we progress, we're going to see a return to something that feels a little bit more authentic, a little less retouched, while still maintaining that very, very high level of polish. And video is still something that we're exploring. The challenge is video is much more complicated in many ways than a set of stills to produce. The business of architecture is not always the most progressive. It's a very tenure-based industry. It takes a very, very long time to rise to a position of leadership at most firms. It's also an industry where you have to mitigate risks. Your margins are very small. So there isn't a huge appetite to try something that's new. A lot of the times, very successful firms that I've spoken to in my career, when they're looking to hire a new marketing executive, their first question is, well, are you going to be able to just keep doing what we've been doing? And their appetite for new ideas is modest. Which isn't to say all firms are like that, but there are some very successful large firms that function very much in terms of legacy, and that's how their marketing materials and marketing strategies are handled. So photography falls directly into that. Video, we all thought video was the next thing. What may happen, and this is something I've seen only a few times, is creating more of an end user driven video experience. But that requires a completely different technology where you're essentially almost creating a video game, and the end user is able to navigate through a space depending on his or her interest in specific areas of the space. But the cost you pay for that is you're not able to have the same kind of control over the shots and control over the staging. So it's a very different type of video. It's no longer a showing off the beauty and feeling of the space. It's almost the equivalent of a real life fly through that would be developed in Revit.
Right. So that kind of answers my number 2 question. How has the industry around marketing for architects changed since you've been involved? And it sounds like we talked a little bit about the technical side of things, but in the actual process of putting a firm out there marketing, how has that changed in the last decade and a half, in your opinion?
First of all, I would say that the language surrounding marketing is evolving. Historically, architectural firms are very aspirational in terms of their marketing materials and how they describe themselves. I like to joke that if you take the 6 largest firms in the world, copy and paste their marketing language from their website, just remove the names, it's indistinguishable. They're all saving the world one lobby renovation at a time. Building communities, and some of it is very true. There's an undeniable power that design has to bring people together, communities, individuals within workplaces, and so on and so forth. But we're finding that specifically in the world of workplace, in the world of multifamily residential, and in the world of building repositionings, clients are now asking for performance metrics. It's great to talk about how you're saving the world and how beautiful your designs are. At this point, beautiful is a given. Let's talk about how you've improved lease-up velocity. Let's talk about how the property, if it's a condo building, performed in the market in comparison to other similar properties. So clients are looking for key performance indicators, for quantitative information that can be supplemented by qualitative information about the firm. But I think that's where the biggest change is taking place. In a way, it's kind of similar to outcome-based medicine, right? It's one thing to talk about how we're healing patients and saving the world, but give us hard stats. So if I'm going to spend $3 million on this renovation, show me that you've done the same thing for another client. Tell me that you can get me through the permitting process. Not that you can, but how quickly can you do this? So that's something that we're exploring, and I think some large firms are doing it already. The challenge is keeping it client specific, not just saying, hey, we're firm XYZ and we're so amazing, we work with 100 of the biggest companies in the world. That tells you something, but if you're a small client or if you're not one of those biggest firms, it sends a different message as well. So finding those metrics that are going to speak to the decision-making factors in hiring an architect, that's where I'm seeing the biggest change.
So it's mostly an infusion of business data on what you've done for clients in the past that has been brought into marketing for commercial firms. And that makes a lot of sense for commercial.
And, awards are no longer sufficient. Every firm wants to win awards. Coming up and showing up to an interview and saying, we have more awards than any other firm in the country. Well, it tells you can do award-winning work, and that's fantastic if you have a client who's only interested in winning an award for the space. But let's talk about how the space actually performs. If it's a workplace, does it improve productivity? Is it a more efficient use of space? Does it more accurately represent the brand image of the company? Those are all elements or talking points that you can arrive at by studying the outcome of your design carefully with your clients. And it adds credibility to the aspirational language that still forms the basis of what we do, because architects are, and to a certain degree, those who do marketing for architects and designers, we're creative individuals. We like to talk in terms of, we dream big, right? And if we were just number crunchers, we'd be in a different field. But having that element of data to back up the claim that you can do the most beautiful, most efficient space that's going to drive your employees to come to work early, leave late, just for the pleasure of spending, their days and lives in this workplace. Well, let's talk about how you can quantify that. So that's the biggest change that I've seen. Not everyone has embraced that. There's plenty of firms, and especially plenty of individual practitioners I've spoken to who don't understand the value. And they find it a very foreign language, and they really, really struggle with it.
The data.
Their minds, the data. Yeah. They really struggle with that and speaking in those terms.
Yeah, that's a creative problem to solve, to be able to pull out hard data from the reality of beauty.
What we've asked ourselves is, how can you quantify design? It's so subjective. We can design one space for one client, and the client maybe have a very contemporary brand and aesthetic, and they love it. You show it to another client who's, much more organic in their brand, or they want more of an industrial feeling space. They'll react to it completely differently. So when we were trying to quantify it, we said, well, really, the only way to quantify the success of a design is how well did we deliver on the client objectives for the particular space. And interestingly enough, the more we pushed these conversations, the more we found that many clients have similar objectives. They want better brand representation of their company in their space. They want the space to act as a recruiting and retention tool for staff, especially in a highly competitive employment market.
Yeah, sure.
So they want the space to increase as much as possible staff productivity. And that's hard to quantify, because when you're, unless you're doing an assembly line where you can count the number of widgets that have been put out every hour, that's a little harder to quantify. But so ultimately, the overarching business goals tend to be similar. It's just, how do you design a space that is unique to the identity of the client while meeting those goals? Because the incarnation of the space could be very different in meeting those same goals.
Yeah, it was interesting for me starting out as a photographer. I realized how much the commercial space is a marketing tool to attract talent, and how much more time humans spend in those spaces than they do in their homes.
All of that may change as a result of these new circumstances. We spend a lot more time at home than we have at the office in the past month.
To me, this whole situation with, sheltering in place and all that, is there's got to be some incredibly valuable data, metrics, and studies that can come out of this, that can just be an amazing study on how to progress our society, culture, and everything else, and how to introspectively look at our lives and what we value, and how we can improve the things that are of most value to us.
And I think, speaking from a corporate perspective, I think there's going to be a lot of change in how companies manage their real estate portfolios as a result of this. Some companies that may have been reluctant to have a more developed work from home / remote working policy will probably see the advantage and go to that. But I could also see the flip side of that, where, if you spent 4 weeks in a small apartment building in New York with your spouse, a child in the background, a cat, possibly a second cat, and you haven't been able to go outside, I'm pretty sure you're going to be clamoring to go back to that office. That office that you used to say, I want to work remotely from, I don't want to go into the office on Friday. You might be very happy to go in just to get away from.
Yeah, I was just with a friend of mine, and he was telling me a guy that he knows is a divorce lawyer. It's just, he's getting, the phone just won't stop ringing, It's like, I think as humans, we get into our patterns that we find homeostasis in, and we make it work. And then you throw a monkey wrench like this in, and all of a sudden, everyone's like crawling up the walls. I'm doing everything I can to stay out of my wife's hair, because I know if I'm around the house, I'm going to start be like, why aren't you doing it this way? You should do it that way. And why isn't this clean? And, all right, build a deck, build some deck furniture, work on a garage, fix that, and stay out of her hair, So it's not easy.
See, that goes back to the whole value of activity-based working in the office, right? It's like, you got to move around,
So to switch gears a little bit, what is the decision process like for finding a photographer in a commercial firm?
Well, I think it depends on how empowered the marketing leader is. So I've seen a couple of different models. There are firms where photography decisions are handled by the design principal in charge of the project, and marketing is more in the position to execute upon that. In the marketing individual receives guidance from John Doe principal, who designed XYZ building. He's like, oh, I love working with Trent, shoot Trent an email, get him an estimate, get him on the books, blah, blah, blah. That's a very traditional, I would say, way of looking at marketing resources in an architecture firm. It's very much a support function rather than a partnership. I think the more progressive firms recognize that photography is first and foremost a marketing expense. It's really nothing else. As much as we all love to have beautiful photos of our beautiful work, sometimes to a fault, it has to be treated as a marketing expense first and foremost. And in those instances, typically the decision-making process is led by a marketing individual. So typically someone who's a little bit more senior, like director level and above. In our firm, for example, the process is we sit down at the beginning of the year, we map out our photography calendar and the accompanying budget, and then I make the decision as to which assignments to assign to which photographers based on a number of factors, including whether it's an exteriors project, a base building project, if you will, or if it's interiors. Eventually, I think you end up working with your favorite photographers over and over again. That's true of all of us. And cost is also, it's more and more of a factor. I think everybody in the architectural industry is forced to do more and more with less and less. Our margins, our fees are small. They remain small. So we have to get very creative in order to work with the top talent that we want to work with.
That's one thing in working with you that I've always appreciated, is that you have a very clear vision of what you want to capture and the ability to eliminate, no, this isn't worthy of our time. We know we need to put our time into this, that, and that. That's a great thing to work with.
And I think that's an experience, that's something I learned from an experience I had early in my career where this husband-wife team, they were both principals at a firm I worked at the time, and they had designed a base building project, which, of course, they were very enamored with. It was a bit of a divisive project. It was very architecturally forward in a more conservative city. Some individuals thought it was a masterpiece. Some individuals thought it was an eyesore. It wasn't my place to judge.
Right.
But they at that time they followed a more traditional mold where they felt that it was their purview to manage photography, to determine who was shooting what, how many shots we were getting, how much we were spending, and it turned into a runaway train, if you will. They had the building shot by 3 different photographers. None of the photos was good enough. It was like taking photos of your child or your spouse. It will never do the person justice, no matter how good it is. No, my child's way more beautiful than this. Right. My building is way more beautiful than this photo. any random photographer who took a photo of the building and approached us, we would buy the photo from. So,
Right.
This turned into, it turned into a $20,000 photography exercise.
Yep.
And in the end, we used the same 5 photos over
Right.
and over again. And they were convinced that it had never been sufficiently documented. So, fortunately, I'm at a point in my career now because I work for a firm where photography is managed by marketing. I am in a position where I can say, no, we're not going to get 20 shots of a 5,000 square foot space, no matter how much you love your shot
Right.
and your design. It doesn't help us from a marketing perspective. Let's tell the story. We're also trying to tell the story with, there was, I think for a long time, architects veered on the side of getting as many photos of a space as possible, no matter how small. It was excessive documentation. I would see photos that we had paid a lot of money for that would sit on servers and never be used. At this point, I feel, depending on the size of the space, you can tell a story with as little as 6 photos. And sometimes 6, 2 of those are going to be details. It really depends on the space.
Right. So for someone in your position, if a new photographer is trying to get their foot in the door to a firm like yours, what is an advisable route to take?
So I wouldn't entirely discount emails.
Okay.
First of all, anyone in my position or in the position to be hiring a photographer for an architecture firm, we're always looking for new talent. I feel like the click rate on emails from architectural photographers is probably way higher than on any of the other junk mail that I get. I'm constantly flooded with vendors trying to sell me something. Architectural photographers are probably, when I get an email from that, unless the photo is really awful in the beginning, if there's a good photo in the email, I'm probably going to click and see what the portfolio looks like and who they are and what they've done.
Right.
Now, will I reach out? Maybe, maybe not. It kind of depends. I find that if you're going to send that, follow up. And, if you're going to take the email route, follow up with a personalized message. And there is the technology to know whether someone clicked and opened the portfolio or the link, right? So if you have that technology, follow up with an email and say, noticed that that you had a chance to look at my portfolio. Would love to answer any questions you might have. So I think the postcards are good, although in my case, mail doesn't always get to my desk very quickly. Right. So, and I'm sure that's true of, it sits in a mailbox. Theoretically, I'm supposed to go to this mailbox, but since nothing important really gets sent by mail these days, I don't look at it that closely. That's not to say it's true of everyone. In fact, I know you came to our attention back when I was at Ad Inc. through a flyer. You were on our radar. We'd seen the flyer. We'd looked at your portfolio. We'd been meaning to have a conversation with you. And then I think you reached out and said you were going to be in town and you'd love an opportunity to come in and, and introduce yourself. Right. Those in-person introductions can be good, provided that you're not a very socially awkward individual who's going to make the conversation a painful one. It's also recognizing one's limitations, right?
Right.
I've had that. I've extended that to a number of photographers. I'm like, sure, come in, show me your portfolio. We'll sit down for 30 minutes. We'll grab coffee, and we'll talk. Usually I preface it by, with an honest disclaimer of, I don't know if I have work or not, or maybe I'll say like, yes, I think I do have something. So I don't want people to waste their time on endless meetings, but target the firms you're most interested in working in or working with. And then another big piece of the decision-making factor that I found, especially recently, is creative pricing structures, honestly.
Right.
Because that is, the process for photography, I think, is pretty similar. The only change I'm seeing is that with digital photography, where a lot of photographers are shortening or doing away with walkthroughs. I find that working with someone I trust, with whom I have a relationship, like you, for example, if you show up at the space, say at 8:00 in the morning, we spend an hour walking it, taking some quick shots, we're going to have a successful shoot.
Right.
We can scout it, think it through, give ourselves an extra hour in the morning. Especially when you're flying talent in from out of town, there's really no need to do a 2-hour scouting session followed by a 2-hour debrief. So that's another way to realize efficiencies where, if I can tell the photographer, hey, I need to reduce your fee, I don't expect you to just give me free work. but let's take this off the plate. So it's one
Right.
less thing that you have
Right.
to do. So it's fair to both parties. So that's one area where people can be more creative. Also, for those of us in the commercial real estate world where we're working with brokers and project managers, we're constantly faced with the assumption that we can just give people photos.
Right.
And it puts us in a very difficult business position because we may have a close working relationship with said broker or said PM, and turning around and saying, well, gee, guys, it's going to cost you $700 for that photo, or $500 for that photo, or
Right.
$1,000 for a set of, for the full set. So, you either have to absorb the extra usage license in the
Mhm.
cost, and that really adds up, or you have to try to say no, and that's not easy to do.
Yeah.
So that's something to keep in mind where, photographers, when you have a photographer, for example, there's one photographer that my current firm had worked with extensively, good photographer, very solid work, for the most part, where she kind of lost the support of the leadership was just that kind of a circumstance where we were approached by a PM who wanted, a broker who really wanted photos of the space, and she just wouldn't budge, that it was going to be a minimum of $500 per photo. And we had to absorb it. So we had to write, a $2,000-$3,000 check. And like, well, that's the cost of a shoot, guys. And she just, she was adamant. And considering the volume of work that she had been given over the years, it left a very, very sour taste
Right.
with the leadership. This was before, this was when I just started. So that decision really wasn't mine to continue working with her or not. But I would say that was one of the contributing factors where I started looking for other talent.
Right. And you had also brought to the table like creative ideas, and I don't know if you'd have the same conversations with other photographers that you might not have had as long of a relationship with, but you had shared with me like, all right, we've worked with other photographers in this manner financially that then gives us the ability to do X, Y, and Z. Would you be comfortable doing that? And for me, I had never even thought of arranging the finances that way. And I was like, wow, yeah, that's like a guaranteed sale for me up front. It makes life easier for you. I make a little more money. You have a little more leniency. So I would say from a photographer's perspective, to be open to hearing different business models of how your interactions with clients can work, as you're saying, is well taken.
And keeping in mind that a lot of the time we, for example, are willing to pay a higher fee if we have more flexibility in terms of usage rights. And the money that we are recouping or saving by not having to buy these huge usage rights packages for third parties is money that we're going to just reinvest directly into our photography budget. So the money in a lot of ways comes back to the photographer. Now, I will say I've shared that with a couple of other photographers. Some have been responsive, others have not. And I find that it's almost generational. The sort of older school photographers have been doing things in a very, very rigid way for very, very many years. They still cling to the belief that someday, somewhere, someone's going to reach out to them for a project that's 5 years old and they're going to want 3 images and they're going to make $1,000 off of it.
Right.
I don't know how often that happens, honestly, but we're just trying to, shoot a few more projects and hopefully shoot them with the best photographers possible.
Right. Yeah, I find in my experience that there will be a trickle in residual on projects, but that if I can look at making a percentage of that trickle in income at the beginning, if I can take that initially, but take a little bit less, it's more valuable than the gamble. And, to make a good client, to stay in good standing with a good client, I mean, that's worth a whole lot. So, yeah.
And I'll also say one of the biggest lessons I learned about photography, and this was something I learned from the principal who was in charge of marketing at Inc., was one, you get what you pay for. So if you hire an inexpensive, there's this notion that if it's a B project, you can just hire a second tier type photographer and, great. Well, 0 plus 0 equals 0. So you get what you pay for. If you think if a space is worth photographing, if you think you're going to use it in marketing materials, even if it's not the most design forward space, it may be worth trying to work with a higher caliber photographer, even if it means fewer shots. because a good photographer can make an average space look great. A sort of a photographer who maybe isn't as experienced or has lesser talent, to put it honestly, is going to take a very modest space, and you're going to have a very modest set of images. And at the end of the day, you just wasted $3,000, $4,000.
Right.
So that's the lesson learned that's what, if I could say anything to people who are to marketers who are having these conversations with, with partners in the firm, it's yes, you get what you pay for. So you commit to shooting something. If you're committing to shooting something, shoot it well. Right. Otherwise, it's just going to sit on your server, and no one's going to use it in a proposal. No one's going to use it in a presentation or marketing materials. Sometimes, if that's the case, get a good rendering instead.
Right. The most shining example of that, in my opinion, is a project that I'll not name that you and I had shot together years ago for a different firm, but the project was in DC. But, being in the space, it was like, meh. But the images afterwards, I was like, wow, good.
I remember that project. There's another one that comes to mind. Same firm, different city. Won't name it. Big name for a project, so we had to photograph it. Well, I think in that case, what made the difference was, one, the ability to tell the story through a combination of very carefully composed vignettes.
Right.
Very also, your control over lighting in that space was fantastic. Mm-hmm. And then also the fact that, you have great retouching abilities. When I work with some photographers, I feel like I've become spoiled in the sense that I can tell you, like, hey, let's remove that door. That door shouldn't be there. That's bad design. Just for the purpose of this photo, let's remove it. Now, are we being dishonest to our clients? I don't think so, because if they experienced the space, if they walked it through, they would never remember that in the photo there's no door, and in this case there is. To me, it's almost the equivalent of removing an exit sign. And we're really only removing things that are truly, truly egregious. So these small things that add up to very, very carefully crafted vignette, that's, I think, where you can take a project that if you had to just shot it in a much more traditional way, there really wouldn't be much there. But by the time you've added that layer of post-production and that layer of attention to composition, you arrive at something that can be quite strong.
Yeah.
Surprisingly, for projects that are very modest to begin with.
And what you mentioned there is a very good point, that the ability for post-production in this age of photography is a huge part of it. I have Timothy Holt, who works with me, who's an amazing retoucher, who deserves the credit for 99.9% of all that retouching. It's me on his shoulder, kind of playing director occasionally. But thank you, Tim, for making Trent Bell photography shine. Picking up where I dropped the ball.
And consistency is very important in that respect as well, right? It's hard to juxtapose one project on a website that's beautifully shot versus another one that's, was shot more traditionally, more modestly, not as thoughtful in terms of the retouching. And also having that relationship with a retoucher or with, the post-production team from my perspective is very helpful, because I feel like I've worked with Tim for so long now. One, I feel comfortable telling Tim when things aren't working, but I also know that, you and Tim understand what I'm going for in general.
Right.
So, having those long-term relationships, it becomes a partnership, right? And it's the same thing that we try to do in the world of architecture. We think that we do our best work. We're at our best when we're consultative partners.
Mm-hmm.
So, in your opinion, what are the most important elements for you to have in your architectural photographer? Well,
I think, again, an eye for a variety of compositions. That's really important. And with that comes the post-production quality. To me, it's kind of immediately apparent when and also a contemporary eye, right? So I was just recently introduced to this photographer who, the centerpiece of his portfolio is these buildings, these street scenes that are shot with these streaming lights of cars. I think we all know what that looks like, right? The red streaming through the city, which to me is a very early 2000s kind of look.
Right.
I'm like, well, clearly this guy has not graduated to 2020. He's still stuck a few decades behind.
Oh, now I got to go back and look through my portfolio and make sure I don't have any.
I think it's it works in some instances. I'm not saying it doesn't, but having a portfolio that feels contemporary is really important. In looking at the portfolio, if a photographer has not had a chance to work with a firm that puts out, top tier design projects. Well, then I would say go to a beautiful library, take some shots of that. Try to maybe you can even say, go to a building and say, hey, I'm trying to build my portfolio. I'll take a few shots for free. I just need something to show because, there's a point where no matter how great you are as a photographer, if you're just shooting paint and carpet jobs, it's going to show in your portfolio. Right. So that rolls into the aesthetic component of it, right? And that's somewhat subjective, but let's make sure it's contemporary, in keeping with the latest standards of probably like quick reference. It would be like a Dwell, architectural record, even Elle Decor, although Elle Decor has a very, very particular aesthetic. Right. So those types of publication, Interior Design Magazine, that's another big one. Those are kind of the publications that we as marketers look to for benchmarks. That's when we started realizing at one point years ago, we should put more people in these shots, or we shouldn't put people in certain of these other shots. Again, in-house retouching, that's a big thing. Yep. There's something lost when someone has to farm out their retouching.
It's a heavy expense for a photographer to bear, or a heavy expense for a photographer to do even their own retouching. But if you have to farm it out, there's such a disconnect that it's a detriment to the overall.
Also, a big thing is variety of lens types, where you'd be amazed at the number of photographers who just aren't as proficient in terms of their technology, and there's such glaring distortions in some of these shots. It's like, did you not adjust this? Like, I don't understand the details well enough, but that's the thing. And last but not least, and I can't stress this enough, it's like first of all, you have to have beautiful images. You have to be flexible, easy to work with. I've worked with photographers who are incredibly talented. They're prima donnas. I never want to work with them again. Right. It's like, thank you. That was one experience. I'm sorry, I can't leave the office to go and see if I can turn a light on, in a building that's 30 miles away from me. Just because you and your assistant can't figure it out. Right. Don't call me screaming at me for this. Those types of experiences. You want to communicate in the interview process that you're there to act as a partner and make our lives as easy as possible. Those photographers I really appreciate, especially when dealing with multi-day, really complex shoots, are the ones who are going to say like, hey, you know what? I'm going to get, put me in, if you're okay with this, I'll get in touch with the facilities person to work out, the details of the lighting. So you don't have to send an architect, a designer, or a marketing person on site just to be able to figure out how to turn switches on and off. Right. Or at least someone who has a degree of knowledge of how a building works. So those types of things. And last but not least, and this is really important, creative pricing structures. Work with the marketing team. I'm not advocating that any photographer shortchange him or herself, charge a fair fee. But if you can be creative, maybe it's a day rate. Maybe you just say, hey, I'm charging you a day rate instead of a price per image. Right. Or, maybe I can get creative on additional usage licenses, instead of making them line items. Right. Whatever you can do where it's important whenever I work with a photographer to make sure, Trent, I hope this has been your experience, but I feel like I always ask, whenever I come back and we need to adjust this, I always ask, I still want this to be fair and a valuable proposition for the artist I'm working with. But, if I do have a budget I need to work within, and if I can reduce the expense of one shoot, which is usually because we don't have sharing parties or other people interested, it means I can shoot another project. So.
Yeah, no, and I've always appreciated you've been clear and direct on that. To me, especially having a client that you've had a good relationship with for so long, you build a relationship where I know that Pascal's not trying to shortchange me here. It's just what he has, and think of the big picture here and work creatively, and and it takes care of itself.
And by the same token, I perfectly respect it. If I'm asking for someone to lower their price, it probably means that the scope is going to have to be tightened as well. Right. That's fair too.
So for architects listening, what would be your recommendations for someone doing a commercial architectural shoot for the first time?
Plan. If you're doing it for the first time, then I would say there's value in doing a scouting session. And then map out, once you have, you basically want to maximize the time that you have with the photographer. So if it's your first time doing this, Or if you're not as experienced, Trent and I, we've done, I don't know, I lose track.
A lot.
A lot. I mean, in my career, I've probably done a couple hundred photo shoots at this point. I'm pretty comfortable showing up and making it work. And it's very rare where I find that, oh my God, I should have brought a vase full of flowers, or I'm missing XYZ. And the images are strong. But if it's your first time, invest the time in scouting the project, hopefully with the photographer. If that's not a possibility, take your iPhone, scout it, try to then make the image selection, narrow your image selection, be realistic. 12 shots in a day is, even that can seem like a lot if there's a lot of glass. Talk to the photographer about, what is feasible within a day.
Yep.
Understanding what time the sun rises and the sun sets. Plan your styling ahead of time. Give yourself some styling notes. Bring accessories. So you basically know what needs to happen from shot to shot. And if you're there with multiple people, you can send part of the team to start staging a separate area while you wrap up the shot or finalize the shot with the photographer. And then be realistic about what can be accomplished in a day. Focus on those images that are the most important. And then have a second category of time permitting, wish list.
Right.
And one thing you and I have learned just recently,
start with the easy image
shot.
Yes.
There's something about warming up your creative juices. I don't know what it is.
Isn't that interesting?
It never occurred to me until this most recent shoot we did together, where we were completely stuck on this staircase image. We couldn't get it to work. We tried and we arrived at a good place, but
wasn't it like a 2-day shoot, and the next day we started with like an easy one, and we were like,
look at that.
Yes, that's exactly what it was. The second day we started with a really simple shoot, and the whole day just flowed. In the same way that they say, if you've got a long list of things to do, start with the easiest thing on your list. It'll make you feel accomplished, and then scratch up and work your way up to the more difficult things. But at least start with one easy shot.
We could delete everything from this podcast and only take that little bit out of this, and that would be so valuable.
Start with one easy shot.
Yeah.
And then you're teed up for success.
Yeah.
And actually, as the day progresses, I think, your creative brain is working faster. You're making decisions faster. Also, I think you tend to overthink a large, complicated shot if it's the first thing in the morning and you think you've got 14 hours ahead of you.
Right.
Right. That's some good advice. So, a quick question: what's the best way a photographer can make your life easier?
Well, two things. If it's a complicated project that requires interfacing with, say, maybe a maintenance person. How do we get these blinds open? How do we turn lights on? And that's really base building projects mostly. Offer to have that conversation one-on-one on behalf of the marketing person, so that the marketing person doesn't need to have that conversation, relay it back, and so on and so forth.
Okay.
And then take notes during the shoot. Try to take notes during the shoot, where if someone says, so that you can get to a first draft of photos that don't need extensive comments. So, if we're on a shoot and I know you do this, I'll say, hey, Trent, when we do the post-production on this, let's remove this door, or, let's make this artwork bigger. So just, it's one less thing for us to have to reiterate.
Right.
So,
that's one thing that we started doing. And I think the quickest application of that I've found is to just take what you're saying to do and put my hand in one frame over a door or something, and Tim then knows that door needs to go or something, just so we don't have to repeat. We don't have to take up your time in the first round of post. And I wish there were a very, very quick, easy way to add audio to a file. I know the most recent camera we purchased, there's a way to do that. This is a good impetus to get me to look into that better, because I wish that there's just a button you push on a frame that, you view the frame, you push a button and say, all right, in this frame, make sure to take out, add in, blah, 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 done. And then when Tim is referencing that later, he just clicks play and he has all the notes. Good to go. I need to look into that.
And one last thing I would add, when the time comes for post-production, another way to make our lives easier is, as much as someone may be very committed to having retouched things in a certain way, don't get defensive.
Right.
I recently worked with one photographer, very talented photographer, And honestly, there were shots that I thought needed a lot more work in post.
Mm-hmm.
And it seemed to be a surprisingly difficult conversation to have. This individual became very defensive about the work that had been done. But if your client comes back and says, hey, this cabinet that appears in 2 shots looks like 2 completely different wood species from shot to shot.
Right.
Can we try to color balance that? That doesn't seem like an unreasonable request.
Yeah, there's a fine line with creativity being such a pulling from the entirety of your personal experience of life. That's what informs creativity. And then to be working as a commercial artist, you're giving so much of yourself into that creation. And then to have it criticized can put a person in a place where they take it very personally. But I'm constantly trying to tell myself, look, you're a commercial photographer, a commercial artist at this point. Say your opinion. I'll usually do it twice max. And if the client is still saying, I disagree with you, it's this, they're paying the bills, man. And this is their thing, They were the one that created this baby first. You're laying your creativity on top of what they already did, right? And there has to be that respect for first rights. So you as the marketing person representing the first created project, baby, a photographer comes along and lays their second layer of creativity on it. And you have to, as a photographer, I think, step back from that and not be too emotionally involved with that, lest you create a prima donna situation where I do not take out sprinkler heads because, whatever.
Well, no, I mean, I've heard some people say that. It's like, oh, well, it's much too complicated to take that out.
Yeah.
No, I'm pretty sure that can be done. I've seen it done 100 times. With the understanding that, yes, we want to respect the photographer's consultative input, right? I mean, if you were to tell me, like, no, these sprinkler heads are really important. They're critical to the story. The composition is hinging on these exit signs.
Right.
Okay, give me your opinion. Let's talk this through. And also recognizing that a lot of the times, many individuals who are in the marketing role are the go-between.
Yeah. And to round this first set of questions out here, how would you describe beauty? To get a little philosophical on you.
Proportion. I think personally what I gravitate towards in almost all aesthetic areas, and I think we're wired to do this as humans, even when we look at a face, it's balance of proportions. I remember, this is a personal anecdote, my grandmother was the product of the Great Depression, and she never had a chance to go to college. As a result, she ended up taking care of many siblings, and but she had this innate sense of aesthetics, and she was a talented amateur artist. And, as she and her husband became more successful in life, they were able to, for example, build out a new kitchen and so on and so forth. And she did the design of the kitchen entirely herself. And the cabinets were all custom made. So she chose the size of the cabinets. She laid out the cabinets. And when it came time for us to try to update the kitchen, because it was getting a little old since it'd been done in the 60s when my mother inherited the house, we tried to rethink, how can we make this better? And there was such a perfect sense of symmetry and proportion to the entire kitchen. Wow. Now, she didn't have access to the finest materials, nor did she know about the finest materials, Carrara marble or quartzites and whatnot. But there was really nothing that could be improved on from a perspective of symmetry and proportion. So when I look at compositions, that's also something I look at: balance, symmetry, and proportions. Everything else is subjective, and it's also remembering that I try to remind myself, well, when I look at, for example, a space, I try to remind myself that even though it may not be my particular aesthetic, it could be a very, very well-designed space and a very accomplished design. One of the interesting developments in my life, and now I find myself spending time in a cabin in West Virginia, which is absolutely not my aesthetic. My aesthetic is
not writing a manifesto, are you?
Plotting a revolution. No, I'm finding myself in a cabin. That's a euphemism for a 2,000 square foot house, but it's really out in the woods, and it's very much that sort of mountain design vernacular, which is not mine at all. And I found myself thinking a lot about what constitutes successful mountain style design versus just a bunch of wood planks thrown up on the wall and, discarded furniture that you picked up at a flea shop. Sometimes it's hard to tell the difference exactly, but if you scrub it, if you look at it carefully, a lot of it has to do with proportion. And then there's an extra layer of that, which is, I think it's not just about coordinating colors. It's about coordinating textures. And beyond that, I think the epitome of design, talent is when you can coordinate textures, colors, and on top of that layer patterns that are not identical, that may seem to clash on the surface, but that work together. And I'm speaking strictly in the context of visual arts and interior design, of course.
Sure.
No, that's really interesting. I think to a large degree, visual beauty is a manifestation of all the underpinnings that lead towards moderation and success of all the underpinnings of our reality. They kind of, the flower of that is beauty.
I think the notion of moderation is an interesting one, moderation and excess. And I think a good example of that is, as an artist, is, for example, Klimt, where there are elements of his work, usually in one same painting, that are extremely ornate, extremely complex, gold, deep patterns. But then his the way he treats the human form is much simpler.
Right.
So there's that mix. And Sargent had a similar approach, except his was reversed, where his treatment of faces and hands was incredibly detailed, but he had a completely different approach to his brushstroke when he was starting to deal with fabric and with background. So that artful juxtaposition of the complex versus the restrained.
That's some we're gonna have to do another podcast on that kind of stuff. We haven't really gone down that rabbit hole having Ethiopian food after a shoot yet. So all right, so what is the thought process when deciding how to tell the story of a space?
Twofold. Well, as much as I enjoy the visual creative element of my brain and my job, there's also a big analytic component to what I do, and there's a lot of writing involved. So I typically start the process when I'm looking to photograph a space. I usually have a case study written, or at least I've had some conversation with the designers, so I have some broad story threads. And then sometimes you show up and you see threads that the designers didn't think to mention. We shot one space, for example, where there's this beautiful relationship between the client's mid-century art collection and the mid-century furniture, and also the mid-century palette that had been selected by the designers. Now, they didn't mention that while we were writing the case study, but it became really apparent to me. And the first photographer who took images of the space completely missed that relationship. So when you extracted the art from the frames, it just looked almost amateurish. There are these very bold, primary mid-century colors, reds and blues and yellows. But when you juxtapose that against the art collection, suddenly the design makes perfect sense, and it elevates the quality of the image. It elevates the quality of the design. So the story component is huge. And sometimes you actually, you're on this, sometimes I find myself on a shoot and I'm like, well, this space doesn't really tie into the main story themes, but it's too beautiful not to shoot. And even if I don't use it in the case study, I may use it for other marketing materials. Sometimes you'll have this beautiful detail of like a live edge table, for example. The chair is just placed ever so carefully. Does that really serve the most basic marketing purposes? No. It does fall into the editorial category of supplementing a story with vignettes, although that's probably such a detail that it, is almost an abstraction. But then you can use those abstractions when you're creating Instagram posts, for example,
right.
Or when you're creating covers for marketing books.
No, that's really good advice. I think that a few smaller architectural firms I've worked with have not put that idea behind it. And I've then pushed back on them and said, hey, why don't you write a story as kind of a treatment for how you want the cohesion of these images to speak to the story of this project, and that will inform how we shoot, what we select, how we compose, and try and develop a consistency through this set of images around this project. And a few people I've done that with, they've kind of a little light has gone on, and they've been like, oh.
All right.
Well, there's an editing process to the design that takes place on the photo shoot, I think. Also, some designers, when they go on their first photo shoot, they want to place the furniture exactly where it was intended to be per the plan, not realizing that it may not read nearly as well through the lens, and also recognizing that different lenses portray the space in a different way. That was a huge revelation for me when I realized that sometimes when a nose looks really distorted, it may actually just be the lens. I don't actually need a nose job. But same thing with spaces, right? Suddenly the foreground looks distorted, or the space looks like it goes on forever, or the ceiling is stretched, and sometimes you use that to your advantage, sometimes you don't. But yes, having that recognition that there's an editing that needs to take place on site. Like sometimes you'll have 7 floors with 7 different palettes, right? And they tie into each other. Well, which ones are going to be the most striking? Do you need to photograph all 7 floors? No. On a shoot that you and I were on most recently, we found that there was a multi-floor space with one floor that had beautiful gold, mustardy color on one of the floors. And that was probably the most striking one. And that's the one that tied in the most effectively with the rest of the images. Right. So hopefully when you get a set of, say, 6, 10, 12 images, whatever, even without putting a story to it, if you put it in a PDF, you should be able to arrange the space or the photos so that as you click from page to page, it tells a consistent story. And there's an element of each photo that relates to an element in the next photo. Maybe it's a splash of gold that's repeated in another photo with another small splash of gold. Maybe it's a little green that pops up again, So there has to be a thread, a visual narrative thread that ties all of these images together.
You are a wealth of information here. I am.
I didn't know that I thought all these things.
Isn't that interesting, though? You get into this, like, I find myself occasionally thinking, good grief, what I do is so simple. Anyone could come and take my job. But then I describe what I do, and it's like, 2 hours later, you're like, oh, geez, that's a lot going into that. So
I'm still in the bucket that, there's 500,000 people who could do what I do. But
I'm impressed, man. I mean, for all the time that we've worked together and everything else, it's really interesting to lift the hood and look at the engine here, and there's a lot going on. It's
well, I think it's also, I think you operate the same way where it's subconscious.
Yeah.
Right? So, if you start asking these questions, you can explain the thought process, but the thought process isn't conscious when you're on the, on the shoot. I just know what I want to see in the image.
Right.
And if I dissect it, I can tell you why, but my gut reaction is, well, because it just looks the way I want it to look and it looks good. But then when you pull it apart, it's all these little details, all these little considerations, all these little things that have added up.
So we have 6 more questions from people that have reached out on Instagram. The first one you've already answered, but it's from Intex Imaging. They asked, how should new architectural photographers go about reaching out to an architecture firm? You had said that email is not a bad option, works really well, and that postcards also work, but that email with follow-up, if you click through, is a pretty good approach. So good there.
And I'll qualify that by adding that don't put the architecture firm in the difficult position of having to say, I'm not interested. We never want to have to say that. So if you don't get a response and you follow up and you still don't get a response, I think it's safe to assume that for any number of reasons that may have nothing to do with how talented the individual is, that firm is not looking to work with another photographer.
Let's see. Tim Ouellette asks, will COVID inform future architectural designs? If so, what do you envision?
And I can answer this from the perspective of a marketing initiative that we're launching at OTJ. We recognize that there's, of course, over the past decade, maybe even more, 15 years, there's been this shift to an open office environment. And that's been promoted extensively. And in many ways, it's a very effective model of utilization for limited square footage. There's a lot of studies that show that there's provided that there's enough supplementary space that's activity specific where people can retreat. An open office can be very successful and increase productivity. The problem is in the era of COVID, you can't respect social distancing. with an open office. So you're going to have to, at a minimum, before people go back to work, first of all, there's going to have to be a deep sanitization process that takes place. There are quick architectural solutions that can be put in place. There are antimicrobial, antifungal coatings that can be put on surfaces, on doors. You can swap out. We're talking about things that don't need a permit. They just need a savvy architectural designer to come in and make recommendations.
Right.
You can, everything now can be sensor activated. Sometimes it's maddening. You're in a bathroom and that sensor never works, but everything can be sensor activated. Doors can be sensor activated. So there are these solutions. They don't require a construction permit. They're fast solutions. You can increase partition heights. You can put glass partition heights so that people are not breathing next to each other. You can de-densify the workspace. Now that has implications for a larger real estate portfolio, since we've been trying to densify the workplace as much as possible. Mm-hmm. So those, I think, are going to be the immediate solutions that people are going to start implementing to prepare for the return of the workforce in the coming months. Beyond that, I think it could go into one of two directions. One, I think there is going to be, once people feel safe coming back to the workplace, once people feel that the risk of contagion is beyond them, people are going to start craving more social interaction. So there's been a rise in this notion of the destination workplace already. I think we're going to see even more of a push where people who worked remotely or have been historically encouraged to work remotely, maybe in the tech field, maybe in the consulting field, they may decide that they actually kind of miss seeing their coworkers once or twice a week. But if they're going to come in, there has to be a really good reason. So we're going to see more amenity spaces. That's a trend that already exists. I think it's just going to be amplified. Then the flip side of that is some companies may say, hey, it worked so well to have our people work remotely. Let's reduce our real estate costs. Let's make 50% of our staff remote. Let's focus. Let's dial up co-working amenity spaces, but let's take offices away. Let's take workstations away. Maybe, you get a workstation at the office 1 or 2 days a week instead of having a dedicated workstation. Now, all of this exists already in some way, shape, or form. I think we're going to see an amplification of it as part of a dialogue. Right. And it's going to be industry specific.
You've put a lot of thought into that one already.
Well, we've been touching it very, very closely. These are questions that I think a lot of people in the design world are asking themselves, myself included. Right. What comes next, right, after this for the built environment?
This is interesting. CB Alex Original asks, what motivates you to work hard?
I think what motivates me at this point in my career is really the enjoyment of what I do. I'm very fortunate to be in a position at this point, after investing a good amount of time into this industry and riding out the 2009 crash. Yeah. The architectural industry was devastated. The firm I was with at the time laid off 70% of its staff. Mm-hmm. I was brought down to part-time. I lived in a city at the time that was big on biopharma, and a lot of my friends were like, why don't you switch fields? And I could have, but I enjoy this field. And there's a creative element, and the personality types that are drawn to the world of design are very specific, right? When you talk to lawyers, it's a different set of personality types. Engineers, it's a different set of personality types. Yeah. I connect really well with designers and architects, I feel. So I really enjoy working with them. I enjoy the creative process. And I also appreciate the fact that I have the luxury at this point in my career to strategize and drive the implementation of initiatives that, of course, support our greater business objectives, but I do it with a great amount of discretionary ability. So that fuels my creativity. And also, I get to do a lot of different creative things. People think writing a proposal isn't creative. I think writing a proposal can be very creative. This taps into all the, I never knew what I wanted to do growing up. There were a lot of things I enjoyed. So this allows me to do a lot of the different things I enjoy without having to be one specific thing in many ways. I get to play art director when we're on a photo shoot. I get to play creative director if we're doing a marketing piece or a rebranding effort. I get to play editor-in-chief for our social media channels. I get to play copywriter when we're working on case studies. I get to play business analyst in my CMO capacity. So what keeps me working hard is the enjoyment of what I do, and also, to be fair, the fact that I work with some extraordinary people and they're working just as hard as I am, and I don't want to let them down.
That's really interesting, because from my perspective of interacting with specifically firms that can afford and employ a marketing director, you think like, well, they must just do photo shoots, that's it. But it's so much more once you get into it, as far as, everything you just described.
Well, also, to add on to that, the term marketing director or even vice president of marketing or even chief marketing officer, they're all somewhat fluid in terms of the responsibilities. And, I have seen firms where, yes, the marketing director, 60%, 70% of his or her job is photo shoots, or 60 or 70% of her job is PR, communications. So there's a lot of, it changes a lot. But yes, in general, I think I encourage the younger members on my team to try to round out their skill set as much as possible, because that allows you to grow in the industry. So don't get too siloed early on. Because if you want to get to a director level or a true leadership level, you need to know how to do a lot of things well enough, not necessarily that you do them by yourself, but that you recognize what is good and what is bad, and you can provide direction to the staff. And also know what you don't know. There are other experts, and it's okay to defer to them.
Peter Malik asks a question that we pretty much already answered. How is video impacting your efforts in marketing? How do you see this evolving in the future? So we'll refer to the earlier part of the podcast for that. Melissa Kelsey Photo asks, is it a good time or a bad time to reach out to architects about photography?
That's an interesting question. I will say, from the perspective of our firm, because there's so much uncertainty, we are putting our photography program on hold. We have a pretty robust photography budget and a pretty ambitious program that we want to shoot. At the end of the day, it's inconceivable that a firm's marketing efforts can continue without project photography. So the firms may not be in a position to hire someone tomorrow, but they may be in a position to hire someone 3 months from now. So it's never a bad idea to get on someone's radar. Interestingly enough, a lot of the photographers I work with or who have tried to approach me have really gone silent over the past few weeks. So it may be a very good time to reach out with, due sensitivity to the circumstances, and the understanding that, it may be difficult for people to schedule an in-person meeting. But at the same time, there may be some people, especially at smaller firms, if there's a downturn in proposal work, this may be a great time for them to start investigating future relationships for work that could take place, in Q3 or Q4.
The thing I keep thinking about this whole situation is that it is extremely disruptive. And whenever there's a disruption, there's obviously an opportunity. So somewhere in here is the opportunity. And if you can be the person that predicts it and takes advantage of, finds the silver lining that's in all of this, it's only going to put you in a better position.
And since most people are not going to be in their offices currently, now is not a good time to send postcards.
I got to tell Tim to put those on hold. That's a great point.
So, and that's another thing where, look at those architecture firms that are going to be most receptive to the type of work you're doing. Every business journal in every major city publishes a list of 10, sometimes it's 100 largest architecture firms. Interior Design Magazine puts out a list called the Interior Design Giants 100. Take a look at that list. Or if you have access to BizNow. So develop that database. If you don't have the means to purchase a distribution list from someone, that's not a ton of work. Look at those lists, prepare a thoughtful email that shows, that engages someone to click through to your portfolio. Make sure that your portfolio is up to date. It's amazing to me the number of photographers, even sometimes very, very high-end photographers, whose portfolios barely function. Make sure your portfolio shows well on your website, and then now's a good time to reach out. Figure out if they clicked. If you don't have the ability to implement that kind of technology where you can tell if they've clicked or not, send them something, and then a week later follow up and say, hey, just following up on my last email. Right. One follow-up isn't annoying. Second follow-up does get annoying. Third follow-up is you're off the list.
You're right.
But, one follow-up is fine.
That's great advice. All right, so a little bit more inspirational question to round this whole thing out. Andy Ryan, photographer, asks, most influential person from your youth, non-family member, and as a young professional?
I would say as a young professional, it was one of the principals at the first firm I worked at Ad Inc., whose name is John Uzay. And John Uzay was he was an architect by training. He then focused on interior design for large multi-location accounts for like Harley Davidson and so large corporate accounts doing workplace interiors for them. Mm-hmm. He saw an opportunity to shift into branding. So he developed a branding studio that existed within Ad Inc. And John is also like me. John is gay. He was really the first role model that I had in the architectural industry of someone who had charted his own path professionally, had reconciled that in an environment that was highly supportive, and he'd been an advocate along with another principal there who served as a mentor, Jill Rothenberg. Mm-hmm. And they had created a very positive, inclusive environment for all people, not just gays and lesbians, but for everyone there, which is part of the reason why we all stayed as long as we did. So that's probably the most influential person in my early career in terms of marketing. I was also fortunate to work with a very talented and very marketing savvy architect, Vicky Alani. And I learned a lot from her about the value of speaking about design in quantitative terms. She specializes in in large residential developments. And she understood very early on that selling architectural services, yes, it was about beauty. Yes, it was about the quality of the aesthetics. And her designs were second to none. But it was also about communicating to the client that this investment they're making in beauty is actually going to earn them money. Right. And it's not just because it's pretty, it's because it's going to translate into a more successful product that's going to move more quickly in the market. Right. So those were three very influential people in my early career. In terms of my early childhood, I had this really fantastic, she was my AP English teacher, Marianne Gianfrancesco. She changed her name after the divorce. High school was a bit of a challenging time for me. I felt my parents had divorced. I grew up in France. I was now, after the divorce, my mother was American, moved us back to the United States. We finished high school in a suburb of Providence, Rhode Island, which was a very different experience from the French Riviera where I grew up. And I was very lost in high school. But I always had an affinity for language, any language, in fact. So she was my AP English teacher, and she kind of made a point of connecting with me and recognizing that I had an interest in literature and joining her in her office to have long conversations about the meaning of life in literature. She was really an inspiration for me in my early years. And I'd love to reconnect with her if I could. I just don't know where she is. So
Again, so appreciate you taking the time from sheltering in place to speak with me and share a huge part of the knowledge of your professional career and life that will benefit a lot of architects and photographers listening to this, I'm sure. And it's been very interesting to delve into these things in this kind of situation rather than us really trying to produce some imagery under the clock.
It's been a pleasure. This is my first podcast, so I was a little apprehensive. I had a great time talking with you, and if there's any questions that people have, I'm also on Instagram. It's easy to look up. It's my first name, last name, and happy to answer them.
So you'll find Pascal at Pascal, PascalMolenat at Instagram. Again, thank you so much, Pascal, for taking the time. Really appreciate it.
Trent, thanks for having me. It was a lot of fun. Stay well.